All right, guys, welcome back to the 10th key knowledge dot point, this third and final outcome in Unit 1. And this one is all about suppliers. Okay, so here we are in our study design. We can see suppliers of business resources and consideration, so on and so forth. You can see only one more after this. So this is the penultimate key knowledge dot point in the outcome and in Unit 1. And back to our usual diagram so we can see where it fits in. So the third of the 4 factors that we consider in the operating environment here. Final one will be special interest groups. And obviously we've already covered customers and competitors. So what is this one all about? So suppliers, what are we talking about here? All right, all businesses, regardless of what they do, okay, they need some kind of supplies, resources in order to produce whatever it is that they are selling, whether it's a business producing a product or a business providing some kind of a service. Now, what this is all about is basically there's a ton of different decisions that need to be made in relation to where or who businesses are getting these supplies from. Okay, so we need all this stuff. Where are we getting it from? That's basically what we're talking about. So any prospective business owner, because remember we're talking about planning a business here, must think about the impact that the decisions made around where they're going to get the supplies from are going to have on the operations of the business. Now, for even a fairly simple, straightforward business on the surface, this can be quite a complex process, and it can involve many suppliers. So just to give you an example here, okay, sorry, go back. If you're going to open a restaurant or a cafe type business, okay, you need to think about where you're going to get your kitchen equipment from. And even within kitchen equipment, there's a whole ton of different types of equipment that you're going to need. Then what about where the customers are going to be sitting? Okay, tables, chairs, stools, that sort of stuff. So all the different furniture. You're going to have bathrooms probably. So all of the different supplies that you need to operate the bathroom. Technology, computer software, your point of sale equipment, FPOS machines, all that sort of stuff. And then finally across the bottom there, all the different types of food. All the food supplies you're going to need, your bakery, your meats, your dairy, your coffee, your alcohol, your soft drinks, so on and so forth. And even within the food, there could be multiple. You're unlikely to get all of your supplies, your food supplies from one supplier. So you can have many different suppliers even within the food. So you can see there on that screen, you might be talking about many different suppliers to provide everything that you need just to run a fairly simple restaurant or cafe type business. Okay. So that's what we're talking about here. Where's a business going to get all the stuff it needs to run the business from? Coming back to the study design here, okay, because it's a little bit specific. Okay, it says suppliers of business resources and considerations regarding the supply chain, such as where resources are sourced and how they reach the business. So I'll kind of split up into the 3 different colors there. There's kind of like 3 aspects to that, and it makes sense to kind of treat each of those as kind of a little separate section in this video to make sure we kind of cover everything we need to. So the first part we're going to look at is this idea of suppliers and the supply chain. Then we're going to look at the second part of that key knowledge dot point, which is from where are the resources sourced, and then finally how they reach the business. So that's kind of how the plan for the video, for the rest of the video, that's what we're going to look at in that order. So first off, suppliers and the supply chain. So suppliers, okay, just to give you a definition, okay, businesses or individuals that provide a business with the resources necessary for that business to produce its goods and or services. Okay, simple as. So there's an actual definition that you can use, and you should understand what's behind that from what I've already said. Supply chain, a little bit more complex. And again, as I've sometimes done before, I'm going to give you a few different definitions the idea is, have a look at each of them and see which one resonates with you, which will be easiest for you to remember. But supply chain, and I'll also give you a diagram at the end of this to help you kind of understand the concept. But the first one here, a system of producing and delivering a product or service in the very beginning stage of sourcing the raw materials right through to the final delivery of the product or service to end users or customers or clients, again, depending on what type of business we're talking about. Second definition, a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute the product to the final buyer. And that network includes all of the different activities, people, entities, and the steps it takes to get the product or the service from its original state to the customer. And then a third one, the network of all the individuals, organizations, resources, blah, 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 involved in the creation and sale of a product. Again, you can see there's a common theme here. It encompasses everything from the delivery of source materials from the supplier to the manufacturer through to the eventual delivery of the end user, or to the end user rather, again, the customer. So you can get this idea. It's kind of like a cycle. And here's one way to look at it. So imagine you're making some kind of, say we're talking furniture. Okay, so raw materials, we're talking about the wood. Okay, so the wood from the forest. So there'll be some kind of supply that's sourcing the wood from the forest, your raw materials, and then that ends up in some kind of manufacturing plant, a factory. Then it has to get from the manufacturing plant or the factory distributed there via trucks through to the customer, which would be like a retail store, and then the retail store sells it to us. So you can see it's like all the different steps involved, right from sourcing the materials through to ultimately getting to the end customer. Another example here, raw material through the supplier, through the manufacturer, some kind of distributor to a retailer, to a consumer. So that's what the supply chain is referring to. It's the entire process of how everything gets from one stage to the next. And you can see in this one here, logistics. Logistics is obviously just moving the stuff around. So how does this process work? That is what we mean by the supply chain. So go back to those definitions and kind of pick one which kind of makes sense to you and will be easiest for you to memorize. Here's, look, just an example here. Now, this is like a diagrammatic representation of the supply chain, a very simplified version for this is the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, I believe, which has been in the skies now for a decade or so, I think, quite a while. And look, the factory where the Boeing factory where this is actually put together is in the US, but all the different parts are made all around the world. And you can see, the examples here. You've got Korea, Japan, some in America, Italy, Sweden, Canada, the UK, a few in UK, Utah. So Utah, South Carolina says some Americans, China, Australia, even actually the trailing edge of the wings, the moving trailing edge. It's actually in Melbourne. There's a place in Melbourne where that's made, the trailing edge of the wings. So the idea is all of these suppliers basically send the part of the plane that they're making to the factory in the US, and basically all they're doing there is kind of bolting the thing together for all intents and purposes. So a very complex supply chain. Imagine you've got if you're Boeing, you've got your factory in the US, you've got to make sure that all of these different parts are arriving in the right quantities and the right time, to actually end up with a finished plane. So a pretty complex, it's a complex product, and it's also a very complex supply chain. Bring this back to Australia. If we think about Kmart, you can actually go into the Kmart website, and if you have a bit of a dig around, you can find out information on their suppliers. And this was as of 2023, when I put this part of the video together. They listed in 2023 938 different suppliers that they deal with. Okay, predominantly in China, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Pakistan. So obviously Asia, very heavily represented. But there are suppliers from further afield as well, other parts of the world. But 938 different suppliers involved in supplying Kmart with the stuff that ends up in the stores that we then buy from. Coles, this is a statement again I found on their website. At Coles, we value our relationships with our suppliers, working closely with more than 5,000 suppliers to purchase goods and services. So when I said at the beginning, this can be complex. Obviously, these are big businesses, these are big complex businesses, but just to give you an idea of the context, we can be talking many, many suppliers within our supply chain, which all need to be managed. Obviously, we need to source them in the first place and then manage relationships with those different suppliers. Now, I'm just giving kind of an example here of when things go wrong. Now, the headline here, and this was from a couple of years ago now, a worldwide supply chain shortage is doing weird things to the used car market. And when it says weird things to the used car market, basically what was happening is used cars were holding their value much more than they used to. And in fact, for certain cars, used cars were selling for considerably more than what you would pay for a brand new car, the same car, if you could get hold of one. And that was kind of the point. And the issue kind of went back through to COVID. Okay, so obviously the world kind of went a bit crazy in COVID, and economies around the world, especially in the early stages when nobody really knew where this was heading, did some funny things. So what happened here? Shortage of new cars, subsequent demand for used cars, from a shortage of small but essential components, and a decision by car makers taken early in the pandemic to reduce manufacturing. Okay, so in the early part of the pandemic, a lot of manufacturers cut their production because they expected nobody would be buying new cars because of the dire economic situation that was kind of being predicted at that time. Everybody thought the world was going to go into this huge recession. But when it turned out the economies around the world did not deteriorate like everybody thought they would, manufacturers then tried to ramp up their supply. But the issue was microchips. Now, it's so random, but it says in there was about 100 to 200 microchips in every car these days. Cars are run on electronics. They're hugely complex electronic systems these days. So 100 to 200 microchips. And what happened was there was a shortage around the world of these microchips. So it meant that the car manufacturers couldn't build the cars as quickly as they wanted to, purely because they didn't have access to this really important supply, the microchips. Because people couldn't access new cars, then demand was exceeding supply for those. And then what happened was people ended up paying more for a second-hand car of the same type just because they could get it there and then rather than waiting. There were some cars, and in mid 2024, the impacts are still being felt with certain cars. Over the last couple of years, there's been a wait for up to 2.5 years for certain cars, and it kind of all started with this back in COVID and the microchip shortage. So again, you can see if you're a manufacturer making cars, this was, it's really important to have your head around the supply chain aspect of microchips, because if you couldn't access the resources you needed to build what you're selling, you couldn't sell what you're selling. So it's really, really important to be on top of supply chain. Now, the second part in this video, so we said there were 3 different aspects to it. So from where are the resources sourced? Okay. So again, there's lots of questions you need to think about and come up with answers to when you're thinking about where you're going to actually get your resources or your supplies from. Okay. So first off, do we try to go to one supplier or do we go to many suppliers? And at one supplier is probably unlikely, or more, do we minimize the number of suppliers, or do we get everything that we need from different suppliers? Okay, so thinking about the coming up with a solution to this, obviously complexity is going to be something you need to think about. Obviously, it's easier to deal with on a daily basis less suppliers. The less suppliers you're dealing with, the more simple that process is. Access to best pricing. Now, suppliers offer bulk discounts. Okay, so if you are buying more of your supplies from a particular supplier, it might be possible to access cheaper prices from those suppliers than if you are ordering less from that particular supplier. Okay, so bulk buying, bulk discounts. I think you probably understand the concept behind that. And then availability, of course. Can the suppliers actually provide what you need? Okay, I mean, that I guess that's the first question. If you need a bunch of different resources, is a particular supplier able to provide all of the things that you need? Another question you might be asking, do I choose local suppliers or do I go for overseas suppliers? Remember globalization now. We operate in a global economy, a global market. It's much easier to deal with businesses across national borders than it used to be. So, it's given us options that we might have once had, but they're much easier to access now than they once were. So think about local. We're probably going to have quicker access to supplies. So particularly if you need certain supplies in emergency, if they're closer by to begin with, that might be an advantage. You're going to have lower shipping and delivery costs if they are closer to begin with than if they're further afield. CSR, social responsibility, you've got that aspect. If you're purchasing your resources locally, you've got that CSR aspect of supporting the local economy instead of perhaps supporting an overseas economy. Also, the CSR associated with the reduced carbon footprint in getting supplies to you than if they're traveling further afield. One issue you might have is that the local suppliers may not be able to source locally at all times. So, for example, if you're looking at seasonal produce, within Australia, not everything grows all year round. So it might be that, for part of the year you can access them locally, but then for the part of the year that we're not grown locally, you might then need to look overseas. So again, depends on the type of resources or supplies that you need. If you are purchasing locally, then there are going to be less legal and regulatory issues to deal with. You're not going to have to be worrying about customs and excise duties and all the different regulations that are involved with bringing stuff in from overseas. So there's a kind of in favor of the local, if you like. Okay, so overseas, many resources might be cheaper to access overseas, and that's obviously going to be a key thing. The cost to your business, if you can access things for cheaper, that's a big win. And also you might be able to access resources that are actually not available locally, or kind of like what I was saying before, not available locally at all times. But really, when you're looking overseas, the main reason you're going to be doing that is cost. Now, remember, we just said before, you're going to incur lower transport costs and shipping costs if they're coming from local, but that could be more than outweighed if you're accessing the resources overseas for a substantially cheaper price in the first place. So really cost is going to be. It's a little bit like when we talked in a previous video about outsourcing labour overseas. It's the same idea. Sometimes it's just the reality is when we live in Australia, it's cheaper to source stuff from outside of Australia. And then the next part, the third part, that should say 3, not 4, how the resources reach the business. Okay, so you've got different options here. I mean, this is kind of like a no-brainer, but we'll kind of go through it so you get it in your notes. Road transport, cost-effective way to get resources from local suppliers. It might even be that a business owner could pick up goods directly from the supplier to save on delivery costs. The issue is it might be slow across long distances or subject to traffic. Obviously, in Australia, we do have some pretty large distances to cover sometimes. The limited capacity of trucks, and that's as compared with other forms of transport, might mean that this is not an option for really, really big orders. And obviously, road transport is not an option for overseas orders. Looking at trains, rail transport can be more cost effective for really large quantities. Obviously, they can hold a huge amount of stuff. Is probably not going to be an end-to-end solution because, unless your factory is right next to the train station and the supplier is right next to the train station at the other end, it's unlikely. So you're probably going to involve some road at either end as well. Again, obviously not an option for overseas orders. Air transport, really, really expensive way of getting resources in, but obviously it's going to be a lot quicker than the final option for overseas orders. We'll look at shipping. But yeah, speed of delivery over long distances, particularly from overseas, obviously, but it also could work within Australia, the longer distances. That's the main advantage here is the speed, but it is going to be very expensive. And then finally, shipping. Okay, obviously we can't use it within Australia, except if we're going to Tassie. Slower over longer distances, but much cheaper than using air transport. So again, if you're not in a hurry, or I guess if you're able to, order in enough time so that stuff can arrive by ship and still get to you by the time you need it, it could be an option. And it's also more environmentally friendly than using air transport, just by air transport. Just by dint of the fact that the volume it can carry and the amount that a ship can bring, on it in one go, as opposed to a plane. And that is it for suppliers, guys. So look, just a few different considerations you need to think about. Obviously, we talked about some fairly complex businesses there. If you're planning a small business, it's not going to be as complicated as that. But you still need to think about these things. You still need to be planning what supplies you need, where you're going to get from, and think about all of those questions that we kind of looked at there in that video. So that is it for this one. I will see you the next time for the final video of the outcome and of Unit 1. Cheers for now.